All right. There we go. Okay, so we are all here and we are on chapter 2, entitled Equality. So just a very, very brief recap of chapter 1. We kind of caught where we were going just by the clever title. The night before Christmas, it was reminding us of this world before the birth of Christ, especially the Roman world, how they viewed people. This was seen in context, most especially of the cross, crucifixion, slavery, the worth of some being greater than others. And we're kind of following up with that theme, but in a slightly different way today with our chapter on equality. So, Glenn Scrivener will forgive us, I'm sure, for not being super up on British politicians. So when he said Lord Sumption, I think my eyes first read that as Lord Sumptuous. And I wasn't sure if I mean, was that a rapper? Was, that a YouTuber? But it was this Lord, meaning in the House of Lords, like one of their, instead of Congress, that one of their houses of parliament. But this is somebody with a peerage title. But this is a governmental official. And he makes this comment that is sort of the founding quote of the entire chapter. I don't accept that all lives are of equal value. And though he goes on to explain it on a couple of times that are related in this chapter, it kind of sets off a firestorm of criticism, a lot of very strong reactions to that bare comment. But this is going to lead me back into something that may wind up popping up in multiple chapters. There are two homiletical questions, meaning in the study and practice of preaching, two homiletical questions that any preacher is well served to continually ask themselves as they prepare with a text and finding quotes and illustrations and all that kind of stuff. But why and who cares? Having that internal critic, as though you had a smart aleck standing behind you, looking at what you were writing and saying, but why? Means you can't just make an assertion without supporting it, explaining it, giving it some context, giving it some meaning. Dogs are better than cats. I think that is a truism of life. Somebody behind me could say, but why? And that's not necessarily saying that the statement is false. It's just saying, I haven't explained or supported it. It's not enough to make a statement sometimes if that statement itself is either an opinion or it's sort of up for grabs. Maybe it's something you could convince me of, but you haven't convinced me yet. So, but why? Okay, as I'm writing my sermon or as I'm thinking through what I'm going to say, I have that critic, that cynic, the smart aleck in the back of my head saying, but why? And I know that I need to explain this more. I need to convince you. I need to not just say something that I think is like a really snappy comment. I want you to understand if you're going to agree with me. Because if you don't understand, you might not agree. And I want you to agree, so I better do a better job, a more thorough job of explaining it. The other one is, so what? And that's more of the smart alecky comment, but it has to do with the personal applicability of whatever it is that a preacher plans to preach about. It can be 100% correct. It can be very interesting. You can even get people nodding in agreement, but if it doesn't go anywhere, if it doesn't do anything, if it doesn't make any changes to you, add anything to you, spur you onto something, if it doesn't have any relevance, then you can have the imaginary smart aleck saying, so what? Who cares? I mean, that's an interesting bit of trivia, but who cares? It doesn't make any difference. So for Lord Sumption to be able to say, I don't accept that all lives are of equal value, and there be an instant all over all over Great Britain, I guess, to make a statement like that, it's missing the but why, but it kind of follows with a so what, maybe. But both of those questions are going to come up repeatedly because so much of what this book is founded on about our assumptions, the stuff we completely take for granted without remembering where it comes from in the first place, these assumptions were not created out of nothing. And these assumptions are not as universal as we tend to assume they are. These assumptions about culture, about our priorities, about principles, about virtues, not every culture has them. Not every time period has them. Not every nation has them. Not every person has them. But because some of these are they feel universal to us. Every now and again, we have to stop and we have to ask, why? Why does it seem universal, and is it really? This sense of equality would be extremely difficult for someone to make a compelling case that people are unequal in value without a ton of explanation. Some of this explanation we get a little later in the chapter where Lord Sumption, I pause every time I say it because I think I'm saying it wrong, tries to give a little more context. And do you recall what the context was?
COVID.
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah, it was in the midst of COVID, and this is a nation trying to make very large decisions that are going to impact everyone at once. It's very complicated. The stakes seem pretty high. There's a lot of competing factors. And this one in particular seemed to be Lord Sumption saying, for the sake of the at-risk seemed to be the elderly, disproportionately. But the young people are the ones who are suffering the most under the restrictions we are placing to protect the elderly. Is that fair? We might put it in those terms. So when he says they're not of equal value, he gives this explanation and he includes himself. Like my grandson and me, we are not of equal value under these terms because I've lived my life. I've had my opportunities, my experiences, I'm retirement age or whatever. He's just starting out. And if you can only save one of us, save him. Explain in those terms, I think a lot of people would, that's the but why. A lot of people would start thinking, okay, I see what you mean. Whether or not they fully agree, and he kind of steps in it immediately after that, and we circle back around to everybody being upset. But as he starts to give some more understanding, a little more context to it, I think the statement itself seems to have a little more justification. And some of this is terminology, value, equality. I mean, these are words that we kind of treat as though there's only one definition, but there's not. So he's saying value in the terms of like potential or opportunity, especially as we look over the course of a lifetime. This is, what was the book that we just read? I don't think it was the last book, but maybe the book before that. But we were going over the Women and Children First from the Titanic. There was a reason why that was kind of a thing. Women and children go to the lifeboats first. For the women part of it, it was intended to be the gentlemanly deference. I, as a man, I am, stronger, more capable or whatever. I defer to you because you women need the protection, you need the advantage, whatever. Allow me to die so that you might live. and we can argue, oh, that's, it's sexist or whatever, but the whole concept of children first. Can't we think of some really heartbreaking news pictures over the years or over the decades of like everything from a time of war to a natural disaster like the floods that just happened, but a parent passing a child off to a stranger. Please just save them. Even if I can't make it, save my baby.
This was really true during the Holocaust, and the Jewish parents were sending their children away, knowing that they themselves were going to die, but trying to keep the bloodline alive.
That's right. And that actually happened in a variety of ways throughout World War II. You guys know that I'm a stupid big C.S. Lewis fan. His most famous work, The Chronicles of Narnia, basically start off, this is a fundamental point of which the series doesn't happen unless during the London Blitz, English parents in London, but in other big cities, weren't sending their children out to the countryside to strangers because it's too dangerous for them to stay here. We're getting bombed every night. And so in mass, they decided it was better and safer for the children to be sent way away from the cities where there weren't bombs. But you don't know. They literally had tags placed on them and they were just sent off to who knows where. It's almost unfathomable as a father to think about like sending off our children to who knows who and however far away and for who knows how long. With that possibility, I may never see them again. But you think about the stakes sometimes, and some of this concept of equality and value and, whatever, I think we've got some, if not a practical sense of this, an emotional sense of this, almost a visceral gut sense that, well, sure, yeah, you saved the baby. Or that child hasn't had a chance and I have. It was my first pain of fatherhood. Bringing home our first child. And just a few days after she was born, she got congested. So her nose was stuffed up. And so she was crying and she was kind of gasping. And then because she was congested, you have like, snot or something run down and it would fall into her mouth and she would choke. And I'm watching this tiny little baby struggle. And this was not a life and death circumstance, but in the moment, it felt like it. And I remember feeling for that first time, God, give this to me, please. Anything, take this away from her. I will do it. Give me the pain. Because the preciousness of that life. Now, it's interesting in one sense that we're starting to feel an emotional connection to an inequality in value. I was undervaluing myself in comparison to her and her suffering because of that importance she had to me and the fragility and there's nothing she can do about it. It's like if you've ever been around a pet that's clearly feeling bad and I just want to know how to help you. Yeah, they can't talk and just so it's the interesting point is this. We're shifting to an emotional inequality of, and maybe let's call it for just simplicity's sake, value. Isn't it interesting that we're having an emotional response and kind of all in agreement, nodding our heads, for putting a premium on the life of the most fragile and least useful of the people involved? Small children bring nothing to society. They don't generate income. They are a kind of a net drain on resources. They are less intelligent than adults. They are less capable than adults. There in almost any fashion, you could create kind of a checklist. And in every practical way, it's like we're picking what you would assume is the less valuable person, but you are ascribing them more value. And isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I think it's because we look at the future.
And that is, I think that's definitely a part of it. You know, we look at the future, their potential, we look at what they could become. But isn't it interesting then that we are extrapolating something that is not evident? You know, you can't look at somebody's future from the outside, you can only guess. And from an outside observer, that future is even less clear. So it's interesting, I think, that we have this kind of almost gut reaction, and it's almost the opposite of what you would sort of assume. If we're not all equal, and some are, more valuable or whatever it might be, well, then it kind of makes sense in just a very material, almost animalistic, natural fashion that, bigger, stronger, smarter, more capable, more useful, or whatever, those are more valuable. That's obviously a more valuable person. But our emotional instincts, at least today, are 180 degrees the opposite direction. There is a reason why it's become a trope that in movies and in sitcoms, there's a laugh line attached. And when they still do canned laughter, this is canned laughter when a woman slaps or punches a man. It's the punchline of a joke. If that were to happen in reverse, everyone would be up in arms. Oh my gosh, that's terrible. But it's set up even today where the punchline is, the woman punches the man or slaps him or whatever. That reversal, can you imagine anyone doing the Ralph Cramden line today in a sitcom about pal Zoom send you to the moon? What sitcom would use that today? None. Absolutely none. We would be horrified. But a woman threatening, that's still okay. A woman slapping or hitting, that's again, ha ha, the audience laughs. And this has just been, we could measure that in decades about how that switch has happened so dramatically. What then do we mean? That's the but why of this equality statement. Why would someone be equal or unequal? What's your framework? What's your criteria? How are you judging that? So tell me, what are ways that we can judge value? Because when we judge value for other material goods, it's typically stuff like cost or how aesthetically pretty it is, or maybe how useful it is, how rare it is. Diamonds and the graphite and pencil lead are chemically identical, but you can get a pencil for pennies still, but a diamond is very expensive. Why? Well, it's much more rare. There's a lot fewer diamonds available than there are pencils with graphite pencil leads, and you can procure more graphite super easy, and diamonds are durable and they're hard and they last forever. They're beautiful, they shine, all this other sort of things. So how do we then apply a concept of value, which sounds like a cost benefit analysis? Value when we're talking about people. What are ways we could do it?
Production. Production.
Production, okay. So if you produce more, you are more valuable. And I mean, I think there's some sense to that. If we were on, say, a desert island where we were just scrapping to survive, and every bit of food that was able to be produced or fished or farmed or whatever was accounted for. Like there's no surplus, there's no extra. As a matter of fact, we have to be prepared because we might die. Someone who is an excellent fisherman and is big and strong and can pick the coconuts where somebody else is too small or too weak or doesn't know how to swim. Couldn't we say one person is a more valuable castaway than another? That's one way to do it. What's another way we could describe value? What's a framework of value for a person?
Well, I think of relationships.
Relational value, okay, how so?
Well, if it's my child, I'm gonna be more protective.
Okay, absolutely. So we feel an emotional connection to people that we know, people that we're close to. This is definitely something we talked about in one of our previous books, and I don't remember exactly which one, but it's basically beware of the person who loves humanity but doesn't like people. I love humanity in an abstract sense, but I'm really unpleasant to the people in my life. You know, that's kind of backwards from what it really ought to be. But we have kind of a natural understanding of like, it would be overwhelming to think of every death that's happening right now across the country in the aftermath of the hurricane and the flooding. If we were to extrapolate the grief that we felt when a friend or a loved one died, and then multiply it by, I think the death count is over 200 now. Yeah, could we do that? Could you take all that in? And we really couldn't. Like, I don't know that I've got, frankly, the emotional capacity, but I mean, even just thinking like that becomes an abstraction in itself. These are 180 people, 200 people that I don't personally know. It's sad and tragic, but my relationship with them does create a distance. What else?
Sentience.
Sentience. Okay. So that self-awareness, that humanity that is observable in an expressible fashion, you know that you exist and that you are able to interact at some level with your surroundings as an individual. When there is a sense of, pulling the plug.
Because it's expensive.
There are medical textbooks written on ethics just about trying to figure out how and when to use resources in particular cases. This is the somewhat unescapable economic truth of life, that resources are finite. And that's in every sense. That's not just I'm not just meant like it's not a political argument. That's an observation of our reality. The created world has limits. I have limits, not just like, oh, well, I can't run a marathon. I'm not physically equipped to run a marathon today. I would, pass out halfway there if even that far. But it's like I also can't be in two places at the same time. And my schedule would love for me to be in two places at the same time. Can't do it. So my own limitations, the limitations of the world mean that we're always making choices. That is the hallmark of economics. You're going to get me on a rant here for a second. One of my minors is economics, and it comes from the Greek word oikonomia, which means the ordering of one's household. And the fundamental principle of economics is that resources are scarce. Scarcity, meaning we don't have unlimited options, unlimited abilities, unlimited assets, unlimited. Life is about making choices. You made a choice by being here instead of being somewhere else. You could have been driving to go see a movie. You could be at home in your bed. You could be doing any number of things, but you made a choice, and it is an economic choice in a sense, to be here and present so that we could talk about something that you were interested in. But this is not the only thing you could have done. So having a nurse in a room, having that hospital bed in the ICU, having that equipment, having those medications, just having that electricity turned on in that one room, and in some sense means a different room doesn't have that. A different person doesn't have that. Now, without saying it's all a zero-sum game, I do want to just suggest that we are constantly making choices about what is possible and what we have. So for something like medical ethics, when is it appropriate to withdraw care? Is it when the person is not responsive? Could it be before that? How much before that? If it's when they're non-responsive, how non-responsive? What does it mean to be non-responsive? Are they just really sleepy? Could they be roused and respond and say, no, 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 I want to live? Did you give them drugs that are precluding them from waking up and saying, no, 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 I want to live? Is there a point where somebody's saying, no, 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 I want to live, but they've been, cut in half by a helicopter blade and there's nothing that anyone can do? Like, I know you want to live, but there's nothing I can do. There's a whole spectrum out there where we're constantly making choices. And we're, balancing that out with various ethical and moral principles. But because there is a finite amount of not just resources, but opportunities and possibilities, we have to choose stuff all the time. How do we make these choices becomes a part of the conversation of value. If a hospital only had one ventilator, here we're back to this, do we give it to the person who's 99 years old, or the newborn? They both need it. You've only got one. What do you do? So this is a very difficult ethical conundrum. I am not a utilitarian. That is a philosophical framework that basically says usefulness is the primary, if not only, real consideration about what is moral and ethical. If it's useful, it's true. I think that's wrong. That's a might makes right kind of argument. But in the real world, where we have to make choices sometimes, and some of those choices are not perfect, a little bit of utility tends to sneak into almost everything that we do. It is not realistic for me to say, I would love to go snow skiing. There is snow somewhere in the world. It could be done. I can't frankly fathom how, but I think it could really be like tomorrow. I think maybe it could happen. But you start coming like just how ridiculously expensive, how ridiculously time consuming, how ridiculously complicated. I'm gonna have to leave the church, leave my family, leave all my obligations, and I might be on a plane for 20 hours in a row. I don't have enough money to pay for that. Whatever. But we're back into this realm of, as we are making the inescapable choices of having some very practical considerations and criteria come in. And that's just sort of a natural part of life. So in essence, for Lord Sumption to say, well, some lives are worth more than others, we can recoil, but it sort of makes sense. The question is, what do we do with it? The principle that life in and of itself is precious is not self-evident. The promise made in the baptismal vows that the national church has been over the moon with for the past 30 years about respecting the dignity of every human being is not self-evident. There is nothing inside of me that forces me to respect like a genetic marker that makes me respect the dignity of other people. So these principles, but why? There's that question. But why? It seems super obvious, but shouldn't we be able to explain it anyway? And he rolls that in, whatever that particular author was who says, what was it about? Like there's nothing in the human DNA about the equality of people. There are working philosophers today who still propose things that we would find very shocking or revolting even about lives that are intrinsically worth more or worth less than others. And that's not just in economic terms, but a value that's not a dollar sign, but a value that says what is actually worthwhile. To hear somebody say that your life is not worthwhile comes across to us, I think, as a deeply disturbing insult. We've got millennia of human experience that says, if I have a club in my hand and you don't, then I can take what I want from you. And that's right and good. Because I've got the club and you don't, and I will beat you up if you try to stop me. That actually seems kind of intuitive. It seems more in line with what we could observe in nature, perhaps, or what we could assume without any external extrinsic rules. If there were no speed limits, how fast would people drive? Don't know. Faster than they do now is my guess. I think that's a pretty safe guess. Would everybody be constantly driving 120 miles an hour? Probably not. But a few people would. A few people would have pedal to the metal constantly, no matter what. So some of these externalities box in our behavior in certain ways. But here's that story that came in with the discussion between Richard Dawkins and will you help me
There
here?
we go.
Jordan Peterson, where the glass of water, remember that story? This glass of water is pretty worthless because it's just a glass and it's just water and it's worth pennies. But what if I told you that this was Elton John's glass? He did a performance on this very stage last week and he left this glass. Now what is it worth? So we have seen stories of the craziest things selling at auction for crazy amounts of money. But because it was owned by so-and-so or touched by this person or whatever it is. For those of you who know, I am the custodian of a second-class relic of St. Ambrose of Milan.
Yes, sir.
That's right. I bring it out every year around his feast date because that's part of the deal. You're going to be the custodian. You're going to bless the people. It's in a little reliquary. It is a little tiny piece of cloth that's supposed to be a piece of a Eucharistic chasuble worn by this doctor of the church from the 4th century. First of all, I can't 1,000,000% prove that, any of it. You take a lot of this stuff on, oh, it's got documents. Oh, okay. I mean, could documents be faked or forged? Presumably. Could have been swapped out or stolen at some point. Yeah, maybe. Well, could have been a mistake all along. They thought that's what it was, but it actually wasn't. It was a leftover raisin from breakfast. I don't know. but I've got it. And I bring it out around December 7th, which is the Feast of St. Ambrose, and I use it to bless the congregation as I was asked to do. And I feel a sense of connectedness to the wider body of Christ, to the faith of orthodoxy that trusted me to keep this, but also to the early church, where that continuity of the gospel for centuries. We are a part of the saints that have gone on before and that are yet to be born, but at one point will all surround the throne of the Lamb in praise together. So all this stuff has all this meaning to me. But that was Richard Dawkins' point about the glass and the water and Elton John. You are imposing something that is not evident by its nature. You've told a story about it, and that's all that's giving you meaning. To that, I would say, now I get to be the smart aleck. So what? So what? We have been built, funnily enough, I love how the fact I'm the one who winds up getting to talking about this. Storytelling was like Father Rob's doctoral dissertation. He's like all about that. But when it comes up, it winds up being under my watch. We're going to talk about stories and stuff. The telling of stories is a fundamental characteristic of humanity. Every time, place, culture, we derive meaning within life and understanding of life through story. That is not a bug. That is a feature. That is not a flaw. That is our intent. The fact that Richard Dawkins was on that stage in the first place and not at home or somewhere else, it's because he's part of the story. He was invited to be a part of the debate. Well, why him and why not somebody else? Oh, because he's a famous lecturer, because he's got a PhD, because he is a scientist, because he is a well-written and well-regarded atheist, whatever it might be. But you know what? You're still a bag of muscle and bone and chemical. And if we all live in a mechanistic world with no extrinsic meaning and no spiritual meaning and no stories, like you're saying, then even your words have no meaning. You standing and sitting on the stage, it has no meaning. It could be anyone or anything. But you're up here and you're talking. It's that's the old philosophical joke. Some of the longest books in philosophy are written about how words have no meaning. That's the joke part. You'll go on and on explaining in great detail about how words have no meaning, but you are using words to explain that words have no meaning. It's a self-defeating precept. So anyway, story, rather than being like a ha, what a dummy you are for making something up in your head and then trusting in it. Like, we're all a part of any number of stories, and we are deriving our understanding, our meaning right now from the stories of which we're a part. We have no human experience without it. The very concept and nature of our memory is narrative. It's a story. What do you know about yourself? Other than the bare facts of, name and date, but even that is contextualized. What does your name mean? Who gave it to you? How long have you had it? You can't even answer those questions without a story. When was I born? Where was I born? Who were my parents? All this, you can't even give what seems like trivial facts without the story popping up. Because that's how we relate with the world, let alone with each other. We connect to reality and we understand our surroundings based off of analogy and metaphor and story. So to say that something is a story is not to say it has no meaning. It's simply to say, it's to ask what the next question is. What is that meaning? Where did it come from? And not all meanings are created equally. Is that meaning meaningful? Is its origin reliable? Are its applications worthwhile? Now, if you didn't care at all about Elton John, you might think the metaphor is super silly and like, okay, it's a glass of water and I'll just dump it out and I don't care. If you were like a Elton John super fan, you might say, wow, I would give you $1,000 for that glass and I would display it in my bedroom because that's the coolest. You could say that neither of those change the fact that it is, it's glass, it's silica that's been heated to a certain temperature and then shaped in a certain fashion. It's H2O with hydrogen and oxygen atoms in a certain combination and a certain amount of them. But there is zero way for us to escape story 100%, even in describing those things. We can't describe a glass, even in its most basic material terms, without a story being involved. What in the world is water without a story coming flooding in? There's no way around it. We are criticizing the limitations of speech while speaking. It is simply the medium in which we live. But have you ever believed a story that wasn't true? Have you ever believed a story that was purposefully told to you as a lie? Have you ever believed a story that was accidentally untrue, but you did figure it out later that you were mistaken on it? Yeah. Certain story, just by saying it's a story, should not make it true or false. That's like, it's a misunderstanding of reality and humanity. It's a little bit like people saying, well, fiction is false. You've misunderstood literature if you think that. Fiction is not false. Fiction is fiction. Nonfiction versus fiction doesn't mean false versus true. It means how is truth being described? If a work of fiction like a novel were false, people wouldn't like it and we wouldn't read it because it'd be useless to us. But the most imaginative fantasy tale can still be true if it is conveying something about real life, about humanity, about the human experience. Even if it's filled with unicorns and dragons and stuff, if it speaks to the longing of your heart or the experience of suffering or the nature of pain or the hope of the future, those are all real things, even though they're conveyed in a manner which is maybe imaginative. So that's fiction and nonfiction. That doesn't mean false and true or real and found. You're misunderstanding the philosophy underneath there. So these stories, instead of making something unreal, can be perfectly real. The question is, where are the stories from and what do they mean? Why do we think what we think? Why are we a part of this story rather than another? Why is our story saying it doesn't matter what you look like or how many weights you can lift? You are equal under the law to everyone around this table. Well, why? That hasn't always been the case. We take it for granted that it's true. We take it for granted that your skin color, your gender, your income level, your property ownership, your IQ, that none of those things would preclude you from being baptized. None of those things would bar you from receiving the grace of the sacrament of communion. Why? Again, these things are not self-evident in the sense of human society went on for a long time with people making their distinctions. That was all last chapter, right? About the worthlessness of slaves. If you were unlucky enough to be captured by a conquering army, your life was basically whatever somebody else made it to be. It could be comfortable or it could be miserable, but it was forfeit at any moment. And it was under someone else's complete control. And that was right and proper. Well, we would say something else. That from the beginning, God made us in his image. Male and female, he created them. So right from the start, at an origin point of everything coming from there is not just a sense of equality. There is that dignity to be formed in the image and likeness of an almighty God who made all that there is seen and unseen, suddenly marks every person who branches from that origin point as a part of that particular story. And as he was kind of relating some of the other origin myths of different religions and philosophies, did you catch how antagonistic so many of them were? That there was always some kind of battle going on. And there was always like what we saw in creation was always kind of the after effects of some kind of conflict. The heavens and the earth conflicted and they split apart, and that created people or whatever it might be. The whole long thing about the Titans and the Greek gods. What does it mean for humanity to come from mindless conflict versus humanity to come from the choice of love? What would it mean for a child to be born in a prison? Mother was incarcerated, was a victim of rape. What prospects do you give that child? Even if their life becomes everything any life could hope for, how much do they have to overcome to meet it? What do you think about the prospects of the child born in a happy family, with the loving parents, supportive brothers and sisters, resources at hand? Even if they don't make any of their possibilities come true, isn't it all right there? Don't we expect that opportunity to be there? If the story of reality is mindless conflict, well, then it makes perfect sense that we would make decisions that reflect aggression, strength, ability to make something happen. But if our origin is the decision and choice of love, what does that do for how we're going to see the world and what we are going to place value on and why? The chapter almost felt so long that I wasn't sure how to, sometimes it's like, we're going to go to this page and then we're going to go to this page and we're going to talk all the way through. And sometimes I feel like there's a single point we could spend 2 hours on. So this felt longer than the last chapter. It felt like there was more to cover and more to consider and more pieces to try to take into account. So just because stuff is occurring to me and I'm trying to give you the but why, tell me if I'm missing a so what? Are there pieces to this from the chapter that raise something for you? Something to dig around a little bit or to talk about or to bring up?
Well, definitely when we think about how we treat people who committed crimes, I think maybe this is but we're all Christian, and yet if someone were to commit an egregious crime to us, we might step into so what? They still need to be incarcerated. I don't care that she's pregnant to have a baby.
Sure.
Because, that person can't be Christian or they wouldn't have killed my loves it, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I think that. That the so what can go into who. How do we cling to our theology? To think that all creation is God's love made manifest versus. That's an unseen God, if something bad happened to me and this person did this, and so now I want that person in the electric chair or something.
Sure.
And that may not be a so what, but I see a lot of like, we have faith while it's working for us.
Right.
And it's a
Yes.
struggle when it's not. And so I feel like that's kind of so.
Well, I often turn to the words of the wise philosopher Mike Tyson, who said, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face. So, when reality hurts us, our response then often tells us a lot about what our true priorities are. It's very easy to make moral decisions in luxury. There's another C.S. Lewis quote about, he said something along the lines of, I don't really consider fortitude to be one of the virtues so much as it is each of the virtues under test. So a virtue like temperance, it's easy to be temperate when it's not a risk to you. But when you're faced with demands, when it's hard, can you stay that way? That's fortitude, that's strength. So the stuff that we say we value, what happens when push comes to shove? And what are we willing to let go of if it feels like it's just too hot to hold? Bruce, you
Well, I was a little less thinking about chapter 1, 2, or whatever. As I'm still kind of in shock at how much our opinions have changed since the Roman times, something like that. I'm still kind of working my way through that.
Yeah, so
This is total.
we got into a little bit of a brief discussion after the class last week, but it's something I think it's worth, if you weren't there to hear it or to just have it on record so people listen about. You know, the Spartans murdered what they considered substandard newborns. If you were born and you were weak or you were sick or you were you had some sort of disability or whatever, they would literally throw you off a cliff and you would die. And we see that in kind of recoil, like it's not that baby's fault and how can you be so cruel, and you know, but what if they grow up one day and they had the cure for cancer and now you, whatever, these things we think about. But in that particular culture, it was a militaristic culture, but it was like our success and our lives in this dangerous world are 100% dependent upon our strength. Not just one of us, but all of us together. We fight together, we live together. So if you can't pick up a spear in one hand and a shield in the other, I can't count on you to be next to me in a shield wall. I have to be able to count on you, because if that shield wall fails, we all die. Does it seem tragic that a child is killed before they even have a chance to prove themselves? That Spartan would say, we have so many limited resources. How can we give the food and the time and the training to a child that we know will never make it? And frankly, isn't it cruel to the child to expect them to do things they will never be able to do? Isn't it a mercy, if you're worried about mercy, to end their life suddenly and early rather than drag them along into things that are far beyond what they could possibly do? But, you know, we hear these words and we you know, they strike us as being so repugnant, but there is an intrinsic logic to it, that spurious logic that we talked about before. It starts with what we would consider a false premise, but it kind of fits everywhere from that false premise. We have changed so incredibly and substantially. We cannot fathom someone taking a newborn and throwing them off a cliff because they were, you know, one leg was shorter than the other when they were born. That we would send that person to jail. We would condemn them. what has changed so incredibly substantially in what is in, terms of the life age of the world, a blink of an eye?
Well, in some countries still, if you're born a girl, you're gonna have less value.
Absolutely.
Than a male, especially places where you can have one child.
That's right.
So some of that is.
And there's the demographic time bomb, especially in China, because of that. So a story that says you are marked by the Creator and reflect that Creator in a unique and ineffable way, always and forever and from the beginning, changes the way we relate to other people, or at least it ought to. So why have we changed so much? I would say it's this story. It is the biblical story of being created out of love and on purpose. And suddenly that changes everything. We think about the gospel accounts, everything from the mystery of the incarnation, that this Almighty God would stoop, which is what it is. To incarnate is to enflesh oneself, for God to take on this frailty of humanity and pain and suffering and hunger and going to the bathroom and, the ultimate indignity of being a helpless newborn, being utterly and completely dependent upon someone just to live, to eat. That this is underscoring there are no worthless lives. And what we could assume or try to put on a scale as being worth less, we're actually given the exact opposite. Not just in the example of Christ and the incarnation itself, the most helpless of all. The most powerful becomes the most helpless for the sake of love. But remember Paul writing about being a part of the body of Christ, and some are hands and some are feet. And he says, we even have these unmentionable parts. And don't we treat these dishonorable parts with more honor by covering them over? Oh, yeah. Huh. What about Jesus telling the parable of the man who was forgiven the unpayable debt and then goes and threatens his friend who owes him $5?
Yeah.
And there's this, it's not just a philosophical statement that we have to accept without a but why. Jesus explains the but why in a way that we would listen like, yeah, that does seem unfair. How could you not be grateful for being forgiven unpayable debt? What kind of person would take this enormous gift and refuse to show even a small, tiny sliver of it to somebody else? And it's speaking to our humanity in a way that explains the but why, but then it changes everything after we hear that story. Because then every time we start to feel indignation towards someone else, offense towards someone else, our minds now have to deal with the fact that we've been reminded that we have offended God and we've been forgiven by him. God could be indignant towards us if anyone could, and he chooses out of love not to be. So why am I doing it now to somebody else? And now the story it permeates everything. People who have never sat in a church, but will agree, you can't say that my life is worth less than yours. How dare you say that that person in a wheelchair doesn't have a life worth living? Without even realizing this is coming from a sense that that person in a wheelchair reflects something precious and profound, regardless of how able or unable they are to do things that other people can't. And that's a part of a story. It just so happens to be God's story and a story that he's brought us into. But again, if our origin is a choice made out of love, it kind of changes the way we see everything. And that's the difference. If your story comes out of struggle, you know, the heavens vomited me out through a volcano, and all I do is survive, and you know, whatever it takes. Then you snatch, you steal, you grab, you kill. But if my origin is in a choice of love, then it kind of changes not just how you see the world, but how you see other people whose origin was also a choice of love. Because if it's male and female, he created them, that means that same ineffable quality, whether it's story bound or not, that I say is in me, whether I am in a wheelchair, whether I'm awake, whether I lose an arm, whether I get so old and sick I forget my name, is the same quality in you. The Eastern concept that we in America we just tend to see around yoga studios, namaste. It's kind of a shorthand for like, I acknowledge the divinity within you. And there's a Christian precept in that, to acknowledge the image of God. That's the human dignity that the baptismal covenant talks about. I acknowledge it in you as you acknowledge it in me, because the same God who made me is the same God who made you. The same God who took on flesh and suffering and death for my sake did it for yours too. Our value then, here's a little theological grenade to just drop as we need to close this off. There's a psychological principle that states in a nutshell, our self-worth is heavily based on what we think is the opinion of the most important person in our life. That takes a little bit of unpacking, but it's like this. As a child, who's the most important person in your life? Probably one of your parents, maybe your mother. So as a child, if you think your mother loves you, you will feel loved. If you think your mother thinks you're beautiful, you will feel beautiful. But if you think your mother thinks you're ugly, you will feel ugly. If you think your mother thinks you're worthless, you will feel worthless. As you get older, who's your most important person? Maybe it shifts from being a parent to being a friend, being an authority figure, being a spouse, whatever it is. But there's a psychological principle that says a lot of what we have in our own mind, we have to frame it from somewhere. So we pick the opinion, and it's a perceived opinion. It can be wrong, but it's whatever we think it is. But the opinion of the person who is the most important to us, or we look up to the most, right? And if we can kind of think through it for even a second, I think there's some explanatory power in that. Yeah. And what happens if it's mommy, and mommy is a good mommy, and the girl grows up feeling good and beautiful and strong? What happens when the mommy is not so kind, and that girl kind of winds up with this distorted self-image, and on, right? What happens if the most important person in our life is God? What do we assume God thinks of us? The answer should be, as a Christian, he thinks we're worth dying for. Out of love, he thinks we're worth dying for. Then, what happens when we extrapolate to somebody else? And he thought you were worth dying for too. So if God thinks that much of you, well, maybe I should too. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sorry.